Okay, welcome everyone. It's Tuesday, the 7th of September. Finance, Economic Development and Corporate Services Overview and Scrutiny Committee. Can I request mobile phones off or to silent, please? Okay, as to the agenda, are there any comments from members of the public? Any comments from members of the public? No comments from members of the public. Any apologies for absence, Sarah?
Okay. Apologies have been received from Councillor Dawson and Councillor Adams. Thank you.
Okay, are there any other apologies? Okay, thank you. Moving on, item 3, any disclosures of interest? Are there any disclosures of interest in the room? No disclosures of interest. As a reminder, you can disclose any interest at any time in the meeting. Item 4, action notes from the previous meeting. Are there any comments on the action notes from the previous meeting? Councillor Dilks.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning and good morning, colleagues. Yeah, on page 5, at the bottom of page 5, the action notes say that it was consultation would take place between the council and the county and the police commissioner. Should there be any formal proposed changes? Well, of course, there has been some proposed changes. We've agreed to enter, and full council agreed to enter a concessionary scheme for special constables in this year's budget. I'm just a bit concerned that it actually says it's advised that the scheme currently sat with the remit of the council and no conversations regarding reimbursement had yet taken place. That was obviously in July. I just wondered if any had taken place yet, and are we dragging our feet, or is it the at the police end? Thank you.
Richard Wiles.
Thank you. I think, to be fair, Mr. Chairman, the reference in the document in the minutes is actually relating to something different. So in the context of that comment, it's around the conversations that we were having about if we make changes to our local council tax support scheme and there's an impact on collection rates, would the county be minded to reimburse the council for increased costs it would incur in collection? So that was the context of that. But in terms of the specific point about the special constable scheme, I think, to be fair, it's a bit of a frustration for all the districts because the police have not yet articulated how they want that scheme implemented. And Claire and her colleagues met the police in July to progress that conversation, and the police are yet to articulate exactly how that scheme should be introduced and implemented. So it has been escalated to the 151 officer group, which meets in September. I think it's next week actually, to progress it. So it is frustrating because we're 6 months into this year and as yet none of that scheme has been implemented across Lincolnshire at all, despite the police being quite obviously keen to see it rolled out. So just to be clear, that the document isn't specifically referencing it, but I think it's a good point Councillor Dilks raises about that scheme because as we sit here today, it's not yet been introduced.
I'm grateful, Chairman, for the answer, and pleased that there is, meetings are clearly now ongoing, and I hope we get it resolved, before the end of this year. Presumably, it can be backdated if, to the start of this year, can it, Richard? Excuse me, through the chair.
And I think that's part of the conversation actually is about the eligibility. Is it actually people that were special constables in 2021 that can see the financial benefit in this financial year, or is it people who are special constables in this financial year get the financial benefit next financial year? And I think it's the nuances of criteria that is still as yet not defined by the police, which is why no scheme can actually be implemented. So I think in hindsight, the police would have been perhaps better spending a bit more time reflecting on actually how they wanted the scheme to work before they asked the councils to adopt it. So we're a little bit chicken and egg at the moment.
So when do you think there's going to be clarity upon those decisions? By the end of the year?
Certainly hoping at the finance group meeting next week, the police authority who are there as a representation of that group will come forward with more specific proposals, and then we can introduce it within the year.
Okay, perhaps we'll get an answer on that on the updates from previous meeting in our November meeting. Okay, thank you. Councillor Morgan. Can you put your microphone on, please?
Apologies. Yeah, pages 5 to 6. First of all, on that we haven't got numbers, but paragraph starting, it was confirmed if a reduction in universal credit was introduced, there'd be subsequent increase in council tax support. Clearly, we now have a stronger steer from what the government's intentions are on that. So I just feel that that's something clearly that we need to follow up. At the moment, we've just got reference to it in our report, but we will need more information about the impact of that as we progress, I'd suggest.
Richard, do you want to comment on that, when that information will be available?
Yeah, I mean, like you say, at the time we discussed it, there was still some a lack of clarity of whether or not that £20 would be removed, and now it's clear that it will. So in terms of the impact, we can bring back further reports, can't we, either during the latter part of this year or beginning of next year, as to what impact that's had and the number of claimants that have been adversely affected by it.
Councillor Morgan.
Yeah, this is kind of a follow-up from that. My understanding is that we discussed the possibility of using the Hardship Fund in relation, in particular to that. There may be other things impacting on the need for that. And specifically using, was it the COVID fund, which was 100,000 to top up the 20,000 Hardship Fund? There's not, we've referred to a top-up scheme, so I want to understand, is that the same thing as a hardship fund? If not, can we just amend this so that it does include that important reference to support? And I did make a point at the time about the need to monitor how that's being used and how many people are asking for that or needing that support. The promotion of that is as important as actually having it. If people don't know about it, then they won't be asking.
Claire Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Morgan. We are looking at the impact of the change. We've received some information from one of the members of staff. Her daughter actually is in receipt of universal credit, and she's shown us the notification that the customers get on their journal. So DWP are starting to notify when the UC uplift will come to an end, and also the impact that it's going to have for those customers. In terms of CTS, because of the way that the universal credit works, the modelling that we've done so far, there isn't any impact to the council tax support award. So what we're going to do is, for all of those that do have that uplift removed, we're going to get a notification from the DWP, and then we'll be able to track that through to see how we can help those individual customers. The additional funding potentially could come through the COVID Hardship Fund. So once we know how much we would need to support them, then we can consider that and bring that back to the committee. The intention is that we'll bring it back to the 23rd of November meeting as part of the outcome of the CTS consultation.
Just to Councillor Morgan's point, though, we're talking about the same fund here, aren't we? It's the Hardship Fund, the COVID Hardship Fund. That Councillor Morgan's point was that the fund seems to be generic in the minutes. Are we talking about the same thing here? Is it the Hardship Fund? The top-up scheme and the...
There's two slightly different funds. So at the moment, we have the council tax support top-up scheme, which is called a discretionary payment. But I think at the last meeting, Richard referred to the COVID hardship funding that we've got in reserves that we might be able to use as part of this support for some of our residents. So at the moment, our council tax hardship, it's £20,000 a year, but we do have some money left over from last year. So at the moment, that budget is slightly higher than it normally would be. And if after the modelling, we then do need to come back in to see whether or not we can go into a separate fund, then that's when we'll bring it back to this committee for consideration.
Okay, so I understand that is the same thing. Councillor Morgan, was that answer to your question? Can you put your microphone on, please, Councillor Morgan?
I believe they're two separate things from what's just been said, so I'd just like the minutes to refer to both, if they can, please.
Yes, we've got an exceptional hardship fund, which is the standard fund that we have every year, and then we've got the council tax. The COVID hardship fund, which is a separate fund, and that's the one that we would come back to in this committee to see if we can use some of that money if we need to.
Okay, so both are noted there. Are there any other comments on the action? On the action notes? Okay, so can I have a proposer for these action notes that they're a true and fair reflection of the meeting? Councillor Whittington, thank you. And a seconder?
So sorry.
Councillor Morgan.
I had another comment or amendment to make on page 10. So I had to flick there to get the page. On page 10, we were looking at the report regarding complaints. And there was some discussion around the need for a new system, how long that would take. And I made a comment at the time, which I thought had got broad support from the committee, and I'm sure you actually supported it, that we should also be looking at a tactical solution in the interim, which could be much quicker to deliver, something, for example, like a shared drive, a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet. It's what they use where I work. But it's not recorded here in the minutes. I can only see reference to the more strategic deliverable of some sort of complaint system.
Did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, I mean, certainly that's something we'll do anyway, because we already have that to manage the current complaint system. So we can use that. We'll take that forward and we can get the minutes amended to state that. But we'll be doing that for definite, Councillor Morgan.
But it was stated in the meeting that the Deputy Chief Executive would accept full responsibility for the interim solution. So I think the minutes should reflect that. Are there any other comments on the action notes? Okay, so I've got a proposal. Do I have a seconder? Councillor Ian Stokes. All those in favour that this is a true and accurate record, with subject to the additions that we've discussed today. Any against? There are no against, and any abstentions? There are no abstentions. Okay, that's great. We'll move on from that then. So those action notes are accepted. We have covered some of the updates from the previous meeting in our discussion of the action notes, but are there any further updates that any member of the committee has? Councillor Whittington.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was just going through not so much the action sheet, but the extra information that we got given in terms of the complaints procedures, and I'm sort of noticing that the vast majority of the sort of complaints by area are around street care, and very few, and sort of with housing and repairs as the next. And I'm really surprised that and I think I know the reason why, but I just need to clarify. We've only got one complaint around the leisure service. Now, I'm presuming that's because the leisure centres were closed. And if the answer to that question is yes, they were, how soon do we think it will be before we're kind of back to a normal situation? Because it's very difficult at the moment. So sort of looking at how if these complaints are the normal, because obviously we haven't got a normal. So how soon do we think it would be before we are back to normal? Because I would certainly expect just feedback I receive from people who use the Mears Leisure Centre. How long before we think complaints would be back to normal? And then I've got a couple of more questions on this as well, Mr. Chairman.
Deputy Chief Executive.
Thank you, Chairman, for you. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. The comments on the numbers on the street, just to say on the street care, obviously that includes waste, and they're getting, imagine the number of service deliveries they get every week. So they're going to every house every week. So, you know, most of our other services don't deliver that many number of services. So it's, whilst it's the highest number, it's not a high proportion. So I wouldn't be overly concerned about that one. And yeah, the leisure centres reopened sort of midway through July. So we'd expect to see that. These are figures for the first quarter. So we would expect to see more or less normal service, normal data reporting for quarter two. If that's helpful.
Councillor Whittington.
Yeah. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. And looking at the, it's this one here where we've got the complaints for the members. Because there's not a page number on here. The number of complaints that we see within 15 days. Obviously, our target is not being achieved, but I know we've got plans in place to deal with this. But I'm looking at those complaints that go to both stage 2 and stage 3 are both 1. I'm presuming that's the same complaint. Just a comment on that. And I'm actually quite surprised that of all the complaints we have, very, very few seem to kind of reach sort of stage 2 or 3. Is that sort of normal? Or is that just something that is COVID specific? And again, just a few comments around that. Thank you.
Did you want to comment on that now, or as part of the complaints handling process, particularly the complaints escalations process that we have now? Did you want to comment on that now, Alan Robson?
I think, Chairman, it's probably better to deal with that now, because I cannot confirm whether that's the same case. I'm afraid, Councillor Whittington. So I don't know. I can get back to you on that. I think if you look at the complaints that are recording here, a lot of those are about that kind of that delivery we talked about earlier, and they are normally resolved relatively straightforwardly. It's unusual for cases of that type to go on beyond stage 1. So I'm not overly surprised that nothing's gone. You know, we're given a vast majority are about the kind of street care service, and those are easily resolvable, normally quickly resolvable. I'm not overly surprised that not so many have been escalated through the process now.
Councillor Morgan.
On the same subject, I'm receiving a number of complaints by coincidence just before coming here regarding the out of hours service and what is or isn't covered by it. And we seem to have some quite key gaps in there. For example, I had tenants unable to access their homes because their key fob system failed on a Saturday, and they couldn't actually get anyone out to do the repair work till Monday, leaving a block of apartment block with people unable to access their properties, which is to me ludicrous. And therefore, it's the sort of scenario I think we should be covering. And the other thing that's come up is we've had some issues with dogs roaming the street and access to the dog warden, where our dog warden's currently telling residents, you've got to hold the dog if they happen to capture it, or if they capture it on say on a Friday evening in one scenario, until we're around again on Monday. Well, it's just completely unacceptable in the situation. So what I appreciate, they're just 2 examples, but I think we need a review of what we're providing out of hours and how that ties in with our responsibilities.
I think they're helpful observations. On the agenda today, we're going to be discussing the complaints procedure. Perhaps if we can return to those sorts of things to understand the journey of some of our complaints. Are there any other comments on the updates from the previous meeting? Councillor Field-Ilks.
Thank you. Just to come back on Councillor Whittington's observation about the low number of complaints on leisure centres. You will, I'm sure, not expect me to be surprised by my comment that given the council's decision last week to keep Deeping's leisure centre closed and make no decision on its future for a few months at least, or indeed on the new build, I suppose that's one way of keeping the complaints down about our leisure services. But having said that, you will know that the people of Deepings are not happy, and I'm sure they're making complaints right now. Thank you.
Again, perhaps we'll talk about that in the context of the journey of the complaints when we talk about the complaints policy. I would like to make some progress. Councillor Morgan, do you have a final point?
Yes, sorry, and it relates rather to the actions from the previous meeting rather than what we're talking about next. I can't see in here, but we had a presentation regarding from the auditors regarding the progress made over the stock and housing stock and its situation. And I pointed out in there that we had that they'd given a low priority to the.
I think that was the audit committee.
Was it the audit committee? Yes, it was the audit committee. Apologies, I haven't got that paper with me to be clear, but it was the audit committee, and I've highlighted that they'd only given a low priority to the issue around elderly residents in our shelter schemes not having had a stay put fire safety procedure in place. Now, I'd just like to say I've followed that up it's not been recorded in these minutes. I think it should have been actually, but I have had a follow-up with Alan. Sorry, G. Oh, I do apologise. I've got the wrong committee. Oh, apologies, wrong committees. Wow. I was rather busy last month.
No problem.
Thank you.
Lucky the meeting's not being recorded.
Well,
moving on.
it's lucky for the
Moving on.
council,
I do
isn't
just
it?
have one comment about these notes. I think I've mentioned this before a couple of times in this committee, that this document detailing 168 stage 1 complaints, of which 104 are street care services. Now, that table isn't very helpful because the first column swamps the table. That first column needs breaking down. Frankly, even if it's just crudely broken down by town, that would be an improvement upon one column. I'm sure that street care service complaints can be categorized into I mean, I'm not going to claim to know much about street care complaints, but there must be a way of categorizing that number. I think I've raised that at least twice in this committee. That table doesn't tell us anything in its existing form, because one column is just swamping the table. Moving on, are there any updates from okay, I'd like to make some progress. So moving on to item 6, the breathing space update. This is in the hands of Claire Moses, I believe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The breathing space, or its official title is the Debt Respite Scheme, came into force on the 4th of May this year, following legislation that was set on the 17th of November 2020. The regulations give people a legal protection of any creditor following up enforcement or collection of a debt for 60 days. And within those 60 days, the creditor is not able to contact the debtor, and any contact must be undertaken through a regulated debt advisor. In July, we attended the Rural and Communities Committee and we introduced the breathing space legislation. At that meeting, officers were asked to review and report the financial implications of breathing space, and also to consider the impact that it has on the residents that enter into breathing space and the actions that we need to take once the resident comes out of the 60-day period. So as the report details in section 1.4, when the breathing space was introduced, a project team was set up. The project team is centrally managed by Revenues and Benefits. There's 4 officers that are involved in that. And we have been ensuring that anybody that enters into the breathing space, we follow through their journey. We undertake all of the relevant actions that are required. We contact each of the service teams within the SKDC area and make sure that if there is any debt that's outstanding for that debtor, a hold is placed for the 60 days. We monitor that throughout the 60 days. We contact the debt advisor at the halfway point for a midway review, which they are legally required to provide us. And then at the end of the 60 days, we contact them again and ask them for the debt resolution. What we're finding is that many of the debt resolutions are debt relief orders. As a result of those, the debt is still on hold after the 60 days and the debt is invariably written off. So the financial impact to ourselves, which is highlighted in 1.5 of the report, currently, we have 37 residents that have entered into breathing space since the 4th of May, and they have a council debt totalling £118,250. Paragraph 1.6 gives a breakdown of those debts. The individual debt ranges from just over £234 to one which is over £18,000. Of the debtors, only 6 have one debt type and the remaining 31 have debts in multiple areas. And those multiple areas are all within the Revenues and Benefits remit. So it's either council tax arrears, which is for previous year, so 2020, 21 and earlier, council tax current, which is this financial year, housing benefit overpayment or rent arrears. The amount of arrears officers are aware has been inflated due to the lack of recovery that was taken during 2021 as a result of COVID. There were formal instructions received from central government for local authorities to cease certain recovery actions, specifically around the collection of council tax, business rates and rent arrears. Those recovery actions are now back in place, and the formal recovery for council tax started in April, and the recovery and more importantly, the eviction process for rent arrears, that started on the 1st of June. So as we've seen our recovery processes restart, we have seen that breathing space has been invoked for a number of customers that have had significant arrears that have been built up during that non-recovery year. So the actions that we are taking post 60 days, we've looked at the type of customers that we're dealing with and the type of debt that they have, and we've taken a two-step approach. So we are dealing with those that have a non-enforced debt. So those that have a housing benefit overpayment or council tax arrears that are pre-summons stage, they're in debt type 1. And those that have council tax arrears post-summons stage, so where they've been issued with a summons and beyond, and rent arrears are in debt type 2. So those in debt type 1, we are contacting the debtor and also the debt advisor and asking for their debt solution. If we don't have that information, we will then resume the original state of recovery prior to the 60-day period starting. We will write to the debtor to advise them of that. It may be, for example, that their council tax account was at a reminder stage and they have April and May's instalment, for example, that's outstanding. So we'll write to them, we'll tell them that they need to bring that up to date. And if they don't, then the next stage of recovery will resume in accordance with our recovery processes. The intention of the contact with this and the debt type 2 stage is to ensure that we engage with that debtor, that we consider any support that's needed. This shouldn't be anything new to the debtor because they've had this throughout their 60-day period with their debt advisor. So us contacting them, they should be well aware of what they need to do to ensure that they are getting their debts into a place that are more manageable and that they know that they've got ongoing commitments in terms of council tax and rental payments. And it's really so that we have a sustainable payment agreement with the debtor. So something that we as an authority are happy with and that we know that that debtor can afford and that we will get that money back into the council. Debt type 2 is slightly a bit more of an added breathing space in some respects. We will contact the debtor and also the debt advisor for the solution. If we don't get a response, then we will do a reminder and there'll be a second stage that goes into that. And that's really because if we don't have a response from them, we will be invoking either court proceedings for council tax arrears or for potential eviction or possession of property. So although, as I say, they've had that 60-day period, we just want to make sure that we give that debtor plenty of notice that we will resume that pre-action process. And they've got all possibilities available to them for that additional support. Of those that we've contacted, and this report was written within about a couple of days of us starting this. So since the report was written, of those that we've contacted, and we've contacted 6, none of the debtors have responded to us. So we have invoked the original action pre-60 day. The Breathing Space project team, as I say, is managed by, by myself, but there's 3 officers that are involved in this. Going forward, to ensure consistency and continuity of decisions and how each of the stages are dealt with, we've agreed that 1 officer will undertake this work. Now, this work hasn't been reimbursed at all by central government. New burdens was considered, but because this affects both public and private creditors, there isn't any new burdens funding I think potentially because New Burdens isn't available for private companies because they can reimburse their costs in other ways. It has been highlighted to central government, but unfortunately there hasn't been any movement on that. So the impact of all of the work that's been undertaken is actually being consumed within the Revenues and Benefits team. So as I say, going forward, we will have one officer dealing with that, and they will be able to undertake further analysis. And I propose that we bring a report back in 6 months' time, just after the 4th of May next year, so that we've got a full year's impact, and we can provide a financial year impact as well of the breathing space. So that's my review of breathing space, and happy to take any questions.
Thank you. Are there any questions from the committee? Councillor Dilks.
Thank you, and can I say thank you for the comprehensive report and for what we are doing on this issue. But I've got a couple of questions. I did read the report, and I wasn't actually clear, and I just wondered if you could make some comment on really how big this problem is in compared to what we might call a normal year, pre-COVID year. I didn't really sort of get a real sense of that comparison. And secondly, how will residents know that this breathing space is available? Do we write to them and, say, the government's brought in this and this is your sort of rights under this? Thank you. And thirdly, it's just I was just alarmed by the £18,000 debt. I wondered if you could say any more about what type of debt that is. What is it for? Thank you.
Claire.
Thank you, Councillor Dilks, through you, Mr. Chairman. I do feel that this is inflated because of COVID. So there are certainly larger debts that we would have been proactively recovering last year had we not have had those stays on recovery. So, and the example being the £18,000 case. Unfortunately, that person hasn't made payment towards their rent or their council tax throughout the last financial year. If we were able to pursue recovery, then we would have done that through due process, and it's likely that they would have reached a possession stage for their rent, and they would have gone to summons and then following recovery action for their council tax. So we would have picked up on that process. With regards to the current position within the county, South Kesteven District Council have got the highest number of residents in breathing space. Now, I do attribute that to the support that our residents have from our citizens advice team, and whilst for us as a council tax team and a rents team, we would do everything that we can to support a resident without moving them into breathing space. Breathing space does give them that time, but it just delays a debt that inevitably still needs to be paid. So we will do everything that we can to make sure that we can support them in other ways. If they do contact Citizens Advice or Step Change or other support agencies outside of us, then unfortunately or fortunately, they will go into breathing space and we will get that notification.
Can I just ask for clarity on that? You said that we've got the highest number of people in breathing space in absolute terms or in relative to population terms?
In absolute terms, relative population, I can look at that. And
Okay, I'd like to see those figures for relative to population. I think Councillor Dilts' question, though, was about context. And is this going up or going down? And that I think Councillor Dilts was asking that there's no historic figures as in this report. Can you comment on whether this is going up and whether it's going down?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This was only introduced on the 4th of May. So we did see a spike in the first 6 weeks of breathing space coming in. It has plateaued slightly. And this week we've received 2 new notifications of breathing space.
Sorry, I don't mean the breathing space, the debts to the authority. Are the debts to the authority going down or going up? And if they're going up, by how much, roughly?
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, thank you for the clarification. Yes, the debts are going up, and that is, as I say, because of the lack of recovery that we could undertake during the COVID year. We are monitoring levels of rent arrears collection rates, as we always do throughout the year, and they are being reported at monthly cabinet meetings and also at quarterly performance meetings.
Can I request, say, 5 years history on that, just so that we can kind of see where that's coming? The second of Councillor Dilks's point was about how breathing space is publicised. Can you comment to address those comments, please?
We do have information with regards to breathing space on our website, so there is the information there. If anybody does contact us, if they receive a reminder, a letter regarding rent arrears, as I say, we don't initially go straight into breathing space, because we do feel that there's other support that we can give to somebody before they go into a breathing space. For us, a breathing space is more of a last attempt at the support that potentially is available. So we are aware of that, and we will advise a debtor of it, but we would much prefer to have that ongoing engagement and support the debtor throughout their requirement.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Dilks, I think that answered all of your points. Do you have some comments?
Thank you, Chairman, for asking for the 5 year back. I think that would be useful, so that we can actually see how much is the COVID problem affecting us in this particular aspect. The only other thing was, and thank you for the answer also, Claire, on the £18,000 debtor. But I think you said that it is a tenant, and it is rent and council tax arrears. That does seem to be an awful lot of rent and council tax arrears. And how long has that been allowed to build up? It must go back several years, does it not?
Thank you.
Claire Moses.
Through you, Mr. Chairman, thank you. I should have been provided a bit more clarity. Sorry, there's also a housing benefit overpayment debt in with that as well, and that's quite a significant proportion of that debt. Unfortunately, as I say, yes, last year there was no payment made towards rent or council tax, and there are some prior years council tax arrears also.
Okay, Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chair. Just if I may, a couple of questions about the role of the debt advisor. During the breathing space time, we cannot contact the debtor clearly, but they are in touch with the debt advisor. Is that correct? Yes. What contact do we make during that time or after the end of the breathing space with the debt advisor? And is his role to try and find ways of finding people being able to pay, or is it just a contact that it becomes at the end of the 60 days, it just becomes irrelevant because he's no longer involved? Do we involve him in the recovery after the end of the breathing space?
Claire Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Councillor Knowles. The debt advisor are regulated. So, for example, the ones that we have dealings with are citizens advice, step change, and also money advice. The debt advisor is instructed by the debtor, and at that point, if there's any contact that we would normally have had in the 60 days with the debtor, we contact that debt advisor. We do it by email to make sure that we've got an audit trail of any of the contact that we have with them. If we would normally have sent them, say, an amended council tax bill or a change in their benefits, that goes to the debt advisor. The debt advisor then contacts the debtor and they let them know of the changes that have taken place. Midway through the 60 days, we are contacting the debt advisor and we're asking for a midpoint review. Legally, the debt advisor is to provide that to us. And at the end of the 60 days, we also ask for the details of the debt solution. So during the 60-day, the debt advisor and the debtor have got certain obligations as part of the legislation. And one of those is that there is an ongoing review, and the ideal outcome is that there's a debt solution at the end of the 60 days. So we then contact the debt advisor and ask for that solution. Unfortunately, we are finding that the majority, we don't have a debt solution. And then that's why we've invoked the debt 1, debt 2 type action after the 60 days.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Charmaine Morgan.
Yeah, first of all, can you explain what the reasons are for not getting a solution? coming forward, bearing in mind that they are working with the debt advisor at that stage.
Claire Moses.
Thank you, Councillor Morgan, through you, Mr. Chairman. Unfortunately, we don't have that information. So where we do get the information, usually or invariably, the debtor has gone through to a debt relief order. So all of their debts have been encompassed in with that order. But where we don't receive a response from the debt advisor or the debtor, which for the 5 that we've contacted so far, we haven't had a response for. So we're working in the dark, really, trying to ascertain what's happened in the last 60 days and work through what the best next step is for that debtor.
Okay, are there any other comments in the room? Councillor Morgan.
It struck me that quite a key part of the process is it is the referral to basically their ability to in effect avoid the entire process through certain types of action, which means we can't claim anything. That came out quite strongly. The debt resolution process. Now, within the 60-day window, would I be right in assuming it's possible for them to be referred to that process by the debt advisor if they haven't already been so? And I just wondered what triggers the debt resolution process. Why doesn't everyone head in that direction, basically?
Claire Moses.
Thank you. Through you, Mr. Chairman. The trigger of the debt resolution is the debtor invoking that breathing space from day one. So for some debt advisors, the debtor can start their own process, and for others, they would register and then the debt advisor would contact the debtor and they would start the process. So it isn't a consistent process nationally and through different debt advisors. As part of the legislation, there is a requirement that there must be a debt solution at the end of the 60 days. I think that there has been nationally more cases than the debt advisors probably thought that there would be initially, and that they are finding it hard to engage with debtors. It's that engagement that they're reliant on. A debtor can put themselves into the breathing space process, but there is a requirement for them to have that engagement. And if they ignore their debt advisor, then the only outcome of breathing space is that they've just delayed that payment for another 60 days.
Okay, please. Councillor Moore.
Up from that, one of the things that strikes me looking at the process, I know it's the end, we've already given them 60 days and probably longer in reality, but the 5 days to me seems a very narrow window in which everything kind of needs to almost come together and the solution be presented. Is that a time frame we've come up with, or is that part of the legislation, the framework that you've been given?
Claire Moses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's our time frame. Usually in reality, we get notified that somebody's come out of breathing space. We look at it probably within 3 to 4 working days, and then we get the team to contact the debtor. So I would say in reality, it's probably over 10 days before we invoke our 5-day notice period. But in reality, they've had 60 days to get a solution in place. Some local authorities don't allow the 5 days or have the debt 1, debt 2 type of action. Some authorities are just going straight into issuing either the pre-summons or the reminder and going straight back to that pre-recovery action. So at the moment, it is something that it's still in testing phase or in the infancy phase as it stands at the minute. But as I say, those that we've written out to already, some are way past the 5 days and we still haven't had a response from them at all.
If you can bring your questions to a conclusion, yeah.
Yeah, at the tail end of this, obviously we may end up, as you said, with people being evicted. What is our legal duty, or there are particular groups where we would have a legal duty to, in effect, still house them or support them anyway. So in other words, is it worth going through all of this when actually we're going to still have to be
Claire
their
Moses?
landlord?
Thank you, through you, Mr. Chairman. We do have a legal duty, but if somebody is found intentionally homeless, then we don't. So if we can evidence that we have supported the tenant all the way through, that we've made contact with them, we get to a certain point in our process and then we contact our housing options team. They would then contact the tenant. So we have a very lengthy process of support for our tenants before we get to a possession or eviction stage. But if we do get to that stage and our housing options team do determine that they have intentionally made themselves homeless, then we don't have a duty to provide any housing for them at that point.
Okay, thank you. I would like to make some progress. First of all, thank you for the report. I think it was a very interesting and detailed report on the process. However, I think there are 4 things missing in this report which I'd like to see. Starting with the easy question, getting to the more difficult one. Who bears the cost of these 4 debts? Who bears the cost of recovery of these 4 debts? I'm assuming that's entirely us. What is the cost of recovery of these 4 debts in these various channels? And what is our write-off amount? That's kind of the headline. I can understand why you'd perhaps want to put some of those on pink papers. But rather than comment on those now, I'm not sure you would have those figures to hand, although it would be, I'm sure you know who bears the debt in these. I'd like to understand the kind of headlines on these, because this strikes me as it's a detailed process, but actually it's quite formulaic, isn't it? We get to a stage where the debt's not worth recovering if the cost of recovery is beyond what the actual debt is. And I could understand why some of these figures may want to be on pink papers, but I think we should see those numbers, and I think some work should be done to kind of understand what is the point where we write things off and how many people are falling into the write-off area. Are those sorts of numbers that you think you can put together, Claire?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, all of those figures are available and all of those points that you've asked for as well. So,
and if you could just, okay, that's great. If you can come back to us on that. And in terms of who bears the debt, I think that's a fairly straightforward one. I'm guessing rent arrears is entirely the housing revenue account. If you can just comment on the other 3 as to who's bearing the costs of those debts.
thank you. Yes, so for council tax, it's that shared cost through the collection.
So we take 9% of that debt, okay?
We do, yes. And for housing benefit overpayment, it's ourselves, it's 100%.
And council, okay, council taxes. Okay, and so who bears the costs of recovery? Is that entirely on us?
It is, absolutely. So the cost of recovery is through the salary costs of the revenues and benefits team.
Fine. So I think I'd like to see those on. I could see why this would want to be on pink papers, but I think it would be interesting to see the headline figure as to what stage we walk away from a debt and how many times we're doing that. Okay, are there any other questions and comments? I really would like to make some progress. So I'll take 2 comments and then I'd like to make some progress. Councillor Morgan, if you can make your comment brief, please.
Picking up what was said earlier, if we could add.
As I say, if you can make it brief, please, because we do need
you.
to make some progress. A long agenda today.
Yeah, I think it would be very helpful to look at the homeless, the intentionally homeless stats, how many we find to be intentionally homeless and how many we don't as well, because obviously that affects what we have to do as a council.
Fine. Okay, we can request those numbers. I think that is an interesting other point that is related to this. Okay, let's move on. The finance state. Sorry, Councillor Ian Stokes.
Thank you. I'm a bit puzzled as to why we are going in depth at this when a full report was presented to the Rural and Communities Overview and Scrutiny Committee on the 1st of July. Who is actually responsible for scrutinising this particular item? Or have you got 2 committees involved, which again is doubling up on the process?
Councillor Richard Wiles.
Councillor, thank you.
Sorry, Richard Wiles.
So promotions, Chairman. Is it promotion? Not sure. I think From recollection, the Rural and Communities actually referred it on to this committee because clearly, as Claire's articulated in her presentation, the predominant issue within this is the financial implications of it, both from an authority point of view and the wider community point of view. So actually, for me, it sits quite squarely within this committee's remit.
I think Councillor Ian Stokes has a good point, though, that the process is not really for this committee, it's the financial impact. Whilst it's interesting to understand the process, I think we're trying to get back to the numbers I was talking about for that potential pink papers. Okay, are there any other comments on this report? Okay, so let's make some progress then. Item 7, the finance update. That's with Richard Wiles.
No longer a councillor. That was short-lived. Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. This report covers a 4-month period, so the first quarter, plus we've brought it up to date as much as we can up to the end of July. This also incorporates our first attempt at forecasting, which is where obviously we try and anticipate and predict where we'll be at the end of March 22. So the headline for the committee to note is at the moment we are anticipating a deficit. I think from recollection, we were kind of at the same point last year, so it's not unusual really to have that kind of prediction quite early on. And the reasons for that projection are mainly focused on our income position and our projections around our car parking and the continued restricted closures of the arts venues. So car parking for Grantham is operating at about 60% of occupancy. Obviously, we've budgeted for 100% occupancy, and for Stamford, it's running at about 80%. So we've taken a relatively pessimistic view for the remainder of the year, bearing in mind, of course, that the first quarter of this year was still considered seriously constrained in terms of the pandemic restrictions. So there was clearly a dampening of activity in the first period. So that's largely contributing towards that projection. The income loss scheme remained until the end of June, and we've given an updated position on what we might recover from that scheme, but that clearly doesn't go fully to reimbursing the authority in terms of those projection losses. Other elements that are contributing towards that deficit are some of the non-achievable activities around transformation, the EY process automation, and also ongoing difficulties around procurement. Particularly more so now as the market is hardening around materials and supply chain issues. So I think we're going to have some real difficulties in achieving our procurement savings as we'd anticipated. Bearing in mind, of course, a lot of these budgets were put into place October, November last year. So we are obviously crystal ball gazing at that point as to what might happen during the year. The other element, just to note about that, and I think it was you, Mr. Chairman, who raised it at the previous meeting, was where there are positive signs around some of the savings we are generating through the current working arrangements. And in table 4, we've started to introduce those key headings and where we're seeing savings coming through. So we've taken a relatively pessimistic view about how achievable these will be. So as we go through the year, our forecast, an optimistic forecast around these will hopefully develop further, but you can see on table 4, £86,000 less than budget on some of those key headings, which are ones we've just taken as a headline activity at this moment around the way the council is operating through a hybrid model of people working from home predominantly. You can see through postage and printing and things like that. We are seeing some fairly large underspends, and hopefully we can capture those not only for the rest of this year, but also as in future years as we develop a hybrid model more succinctly. In terms of general fund, less to say on that particular one. We've introduced the land acquisition, which took place during this financial year, although authority for it was in last financial year. So that land acquisition is now included. So from a general fund perspective, the outturn for capital is more or less where we anticipated it at the outset. So nothing particularly to note on that. And the reserves are given as in Appendix D for completeness. But again, the reserve projections are broadly in line with budget at this point. You may remember we talked about the COVID recovery reserve at the last meeting, and the committee wanted to see the criteria for its use, and we'll probably see this being played out during the year as we sit with a projection of a deficit on the general fund. And you can see there are 4 distinct areas of the budget that we may need to use the reserve for. Remember, that sits at just over £1 million, is only for this financial year. And so for the authority to use that, it needs to be using it wisely, but also to protect ultimately the taxpayer and the overall position of the authority. So you'll see there's a set of criteria that is in place, and that will be for use by the Chief Exec, 151, and the Cabinet Member for Finance to consider as we go through the financial year. But if we start to see a more positive forecast, then clearly that takes pressure off that reserve to be brought into use. In terms of the HRA, less to say about the revenue side at this point in time, although, as we've said, we're seeing some pressures in the staffing establishment for the HRA and also on the materials side. So we would anticipate that expenditure forecast deficit potentially to increase during the rest of this financial year. The more comprehensive note is in respect to the new build. The committee at the last meeting wanted to see more information about the new build projections. Sorry, do you want
to talk into your microphone? You're echoing, actually.
Warbling. So within table 10, but also in the following paragraph, the Director of Property has taken the opportunity to give a more developed update on the new build, and you can see the new build is now being projected at 6.9 million less. That's deliberate, because running parallel with the new build ambition is also the stock condition survey that we've talked about at this committee for a number of weeks. The full information is expected to start to be received around October time, and the authority needs to get itself ready to respond to the outcome of that stock condition, which ultimately will put more pressure on its reserves, because the priority will be on its existing stock as well as fulfilling the ambition of the new build. So there is a semi-deliberate pause in that new build to allow the reserves to be positioned to take the findings of that. So hopefully the director has given a fuller explanation as to what the realisation is around new build. And of course that'll carry through into 22-23 and 23-24 as the budget development programme continues. The report also includes cash flow modelling, an up-to-date position on that, which hopefully reassures the committee that from a cash flow point of view, we're not seeing anything like the volatility we had last year, because clearly, as Claire's already said, the recovery processes are back into operation, so our cash flow is back to the normal levels that we would normally see, and that's borne out by the collection rates as well that you'll see in table 11. We've also included again the risk register, and you'll see there's a new item on the risk register which is about the deficit projection, and it also confirms how the COVID recovery reserve may be used as mitigation against that. So clearly, as we go through the rest of the financial year, we'll continue to monitor that position as well. So there's a lot more information in the appendices. I'm not going to go through each one in turn, but clearly members may have questions arising from those. Thank you.
Okay, are there any questions in the room? Councillor Dilks.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Richard, for the report. There's lots of detail in it, but what I'm looking for, and I just wondered if you might have a headline figure, is a sort of a stab really at what we think. What's your assessment of given all the savings and the grants that we've had from government and elsewhere, perhaps, and also the costs? What was the overall impact of COVID in last year's budget, and what do we expect it to be in this year's budget?
Richard Wells, do you think you're in a position to say that at this stage, or is it a bit too early?
I'm only kind of at high level. I mean, clearly this committee has considered the outturn from last year at its meeting, and Governance and Audit Committee and Cabinet have both reviewed the outturn position. We did reach the outturn in a relatively balanced position, and that was a trade-off, if you like, of government support through the tranches of funding it gave local government, also the income recovery co-payment loss scheme that it introduced, and also we took advantage of furlough some of our staff as well. So I think longer term, what we're seeing in this year is still some of the implications and the impact of it. We're seeing less on the expenditure side, because clearly we're not having to meet expenditure costs that weren't unanticipated, because for us fees and charges is largely out of our direct control. So we are seeing through our income analysis, we're not reaching those levels of income that in the past we would see quite easily and achieve quite easily. So I think we're still coming to grips with the impact. I think it's fairly clear to see that there'll be no further government funding coming forward at the moment anyway, unless there is a third wave or subsequent waves. The government, there's no narrative around that. So I think from this point onwards, we're kind of on our own in terms of the impact. But as we see here today, we are seeing £1 million deficit.
I think as part of the work plan, there was a request for an impact and lessons learned from COVID, but I think that's in the future. I think we're still getting to grips with that, is the feedback we're getting from officers. Councillor Morgan.
Forgive me for being slightly parochial here, but my understanding going back was that I call it the Savoy site, the Savoy Cinema site, was forecast at bringing in quite considerable income. Clearly the site is the cinema is occupied, but the rest of the building is not. And clearly that's hitting our finances. How much is it costing us for it to be empty, as in lost revenue? And what progress have we made getting occupants for that building? And what sort of use are we envisaging? Because I understand that there have been some reviews, but not all local members are aware of what types of use are envisaged.
Are those numbers you have to hand, or would you?
I mean, from a headline point of view, in the budget, we built in the operational costs of holding that asset, which is about £75,000, which is the business rates and maintenance and ongoing utility standing charges for it. You probably notice if you go past, there are signs on there from Pygott and Crone, who are appointed agents for promoting the A3, particularly downstairs. As you know, the upstairs is allocated to the University of Lincoln as a site, which I know there's conversations ongoing with them as to whether that's still a requirement of theirs. So, but the A3 downstairs is still being promoted for commercial users, but the market at the moment isn't coming forward with a viable proposal to use that space. So that's indicative of generally the market in the area. We hadn't budgeted for the income for those sites. So yes, there's a cost implication of holding it, but we hadn't built in the income projections for it. So it's not having a detrimental impact on the budgets per se, because we hadn't built those in. But clearly, as they're standing there as empty assets, then it's an opportunity lost in terms of income projection. So at the moment, we are kind of waiting for the market to positively respond to using it.
Are there any other comments and questions? Councillor Whittington.
Yes, thanks, Mr. Chairman. I think some of the points I was going to raise have already been covered by other questions, and also by the comments that Richard has also made. I'm sort of looking in terms of on page 28, when we start talking about sort of our proposal for new builds of social housing, which actually I actually appreciate this detail, because I know it's been asked, and it is sort of really useful to sort of see it in here. But we're talking about the units currently under construction, and we're talking about, we've got 7 at Bourne and 5 at Stamford, and the total contract value is £1.8 million for these, which would indicate a build cost per unit of about 150k. And then we're talking about 3 at Riverside Walk with a contract value of 80k, which would indicate that each of those has got a build cost of just about 26,000. I'm just wondering why such a big discrepancy between sort of the build costs in Bourne and Stamford. And I have to say 150k does look more of a realistic figure. I mean, it's something fundamentally different to the ones in Grantham. And I know that certainly regarding the ones at Large Close in Grantham, I know the local residents are, I obviously appreciate, that we do need to build more social housing, but I understand certainly because it's in my county patch that the residents of Large Close are particularly concerned about such a large development going there. So that's my first question there. I've got a few more to pick up on some specifics on Appendix B on page 33, the forecast variance on yielding control, which I think is quite significant because it's 20% of the variance. There's no sort of note about it in the notes. So just wondering if you could give me a bit of background on that one. And then going forward onto page 34, and I know these are some sort of savings that we discussed before around procurement and process automation. And I know these have kind of been ongoing for several years now, and we don't really seem to be sort of achieving them. I just wanted a little bit more sort of, update about, do we really think these are realistic, or what do we need to do to make them realistic and achievable? And then, sorry about this. Yeah, going forward on to page 37, disabled facilities grant. I know this is sort of showing it's 228k forecast to year spend. I'm just wondering potential this, because I know some funding is held also by the county council, and I'm just wondering potentially, because when I see something like this, which is a grant to sort of support, in improving housing where people with needs are. If there's any unmet need there that we may need to identify. Sorry about this, but I've picked up quite a few. And then sort of going forward to, I think that may actually, Mr. Chairman, because I'm just obviously because some have been covered up already. The final one on page 43, where we're talking about housing system enhancements, where the budget for the year is 690k, and obviously it's now it looks like the project is now being pushed back to 22-23. Just some help to as to what that scheme actually is, and I think, Mr. Chairman, that's it. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Richard Wiles.
Okay, thank you. Wow. Trying to follow that, make notes and have responses ready. So yeah, okay. So new build, I admit at first glance that Riverside Walk value looks a little bit out of sync. I haven't got the detail, I'm afraid. So whether those property types are existing and they're actually adaptations, or whether they're not wholly new build, so it's not a direct comparison with the line above, but clearly, yeah, three new properties for 80,000 doesn't sound very realistic. So I imagine there's some, it's not quite as it reads. So I'll have to get the director of property to email back to the committee, because clearly that section has been prepared by him, and he's unfortunately not here today. So I can't really stray into that without kind of contradicting what he was saying. So we'll come back on that one. In terms of procurement and process automation, then yes, that these are recurring savings that were built in over a 3-year period. This is actually the final year of those 3 years. Talk about process automation first, then that was a project that was actually started in 2018. And it was based on a 200,000 per annum saving for the authority. So budgets were built in for 1920, 2021 and 21-22. What the reality has been that the baseline that was done in 2018 doesn't bear much resemblance to the reality of today in terms of the processing volumes that were anticipated, because the world has changed quite so significantly. So 170 is the remaining, if you like, unfound savings. So some savings have been found through the automation. Most of the automation is actually in Claire's area, so she's probably better than me to talk about what's actually happening on the ground. The customer enhancements are very palatable, aren't they, in terms of accessing discretionary housing payment applications, things like that. So the front end has been really improved, and so that automation from that side has been very apparent. But the unlocking of savings, which at the end of the day this is about staffing really, are not significant enough to justify any changes in the actual staffing cohort that support these activities. So the changes are quite subtle, the kind of arms and legs rather than whole FTE. So we've not been able to unlock the savings. So I think the project is successful in terms of the seamlessness of the activity end to end, but in terms of cashable lock-in, it's not proven to be what it was anticipated at the start. The procurement, the actual savings for the budget was 350,000. So what we're talking about here is the residual balance, which I think is around 170, 180 from memory. We have a new procurement officer who actually started last Wednesday, and part of their remit is to further unlock savings. So I think at the moment, as I say, that's a relatively pessimistic position we're projecting, but I know in terms of the work plan of the officer, then finding further savings is very much part of the role. So I'd be cautiously optimistic we will start to see further savings coming through during this year, but also going into next year as well. So that's just a reality of where we are with it. In terms of DFGs, as Councillor Whittington knows, it's a demand-led service. So that projection is based on what we know at this point in time. We also got some late allocations from government, so that bolstered the budget further. So at the moment, demand hasn't yet caught up with the amount of resources we've got. But again, I would imagine that to be a forecast that will change during the year. We more or less spent all the allocation last year, so I'd be optimistic again that that $250,000 or thereabouts reduction that we've forecast will perhaps change during the rest of this financial year. And in terms of housing systems, then yes, the new director of housing who came in has deliberately paused that project because it's such a significant investment and it has such a wide implication in terms of how that system interacts with other systems of the authority. He wanted more work being done on the requirements of the council and also how it impacts elsewhere across the authority. That's probably a year-long project, actually, in terms of the amount of investment needed and officer time needed to implement it. So with everything else going on in housing, I think he wisely suggested that project should be paused. In terms of builder control, I don't know. I've got an answer. Oh, sorry, Alison's got an answer on that 20% variance.
Alison.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The net budget for building control is £103,000. In table 3, we're projecting an additional £20,000 of income, which has then resulted in a £20,000 saving, hence the 20% variance.
Alison, can you also comment on process automation? This was one of my questions. That we originally, this was in the budget to save £200,000 every year. And am I right in thinking we've achieved £30,000? So sorry, Councillor Adam Stokes, did you want to comment on that as well?
No, it wasn't on that point. It was on Councillor Whittington's with regards to Riverside Walk. That was a conversion of a existing commercial property, so that's why.
Okay, apologies. So just returning to the point about process automation, I know this has been in the budget for a long time. Alison, Richard Wiles said this was in your area.
Sorry, Mr. Chairman, I have actually spoken about process automation. I'm happy to say it all again, but I did say it as part of my feedback. Did anyone hear any of that? Sorry, I did. Do you want me to say it? I can say it again, but I have said it.
Okay, are there any other questions in the room? Okay, I would like to make some, Councillor Dilks.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thanks for the report. I'm interested in the Hra Capital Forecast outturn position on page 27, going over to 28. And I welcome the 15 new units that are under construction and expect to be completed this financial year. However, I wanted to ask, I know we had at some point, and I'm not sure if it was in this committee or elsewhere, a debate when they were being planned as to whether or not they would be subject to right to buy, and if we could find a way that they were not subject to right to buy. So I'm asking, will they be subject to right to buy? And also, if you could say, please, how many do we lose? How many units do we lose now in a normal year on right to buy, and how many did we lose last year on right to buy? Thank you.
I think they're questions for the Director of Housing, actually. So I think we'll request a written response. Okay, Richard Wiles, if you can answer that.
I think I can answer them. In terms of these ones, then we can't exclude them specifically from right to buy. That is an automatic right of a tenant. I think the only opportunity we've got is if we designate them slightly differently, but I don't think any of these new builds would fall under a designation. The financial protection the authority has is there's a cost floor protection, which means that anybody exercising their right to buy wouldn't automatically get the normal discounts they would receive. They would have to meet the costs that the council incurred at bringing that new build into fruition. So the council would walk away effectively cost neutral. So it doesn't quite help, but at least it doesn't mean the HOA is financially disadvantaged. On average, I don't know if you use the word lose, I won't use that word, but we sell about 70 a year on average through 70. Last year was slightly less. I think it was just below 28 last year, but of course for obvious reasons. But in the normal year, if you like, it's around 70 we sell through right to buy.
Okay, are there any other questions in the room on this report? Okay, I'd like to make some progress then. Review of the special expense areas. This is with Richard Wiles.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe we had this topic here more at the same time last year. So I'll kind of just go over, if you like, the history of the special expense areas. So the authority currently has 4 special expense areas. We did have 5 this time last year. Deepings was removed from April 21 due to the change of the service provision for the playing fields in Deepings, which moved across to the leisure contractor. So currently we have 4 special expense areas in each of the towns and in Langtoft. The idea of the special expense is to avoid double taxation. So effectively, the district council's costs of providing services that are specific to the location are charged specifically to that parish. So in other words, it would stop somebody in Welby paying towards a function or facility that's specifically located in Grantham town centre. So it kind of ensures, if you like, that local taxation is picked up for a local service provision. So that's why they are in existence. The idea of them is to ensure ultimately that there's this kind of parity across all the council tax. Interestingly enough, the overall council tax charge for the district council has to take into consideration the special expense areas. So they don't sit outside of our being the council referendum caps and our overall restriction on our bandy charge. It is an important part of when we do our calculation. So whilst it looks like they sit outside of normal council tax setting, they're actually an integral part of the district council. So when it's looking at its overall general fund expenditure, it does have to take into consideration the charge that's going into the special expense area. The lion's share of special expense area costs actually are in respect of grounds maintenance, because by definition, most of the services that are charged to them are usually playing fields or open space or parks, and the lion's share of costs that go into those activities are grounds maintenance. The one exception that kind of sits outside of that is Grantham, because in the absence of a town council, some of the special expense charges are in respect of perhaps functions you'd expect a town council to undertake, such as Christmas activities, the cemetery, the fun day, Christmas illuminations, things like that. So they are charged again specifically to it. There's also with each of them a reserve that's been accumulated over a number of years. That's where the charge that's going into that special expense area perhaps is slightly higher than the costs are being incurred, and conversely, where there have perhaps been underspends within those special expenses during the year, and the collectible debit has exceeded what that charge is. If that does occur, then from a finance point of view, we put those back into a specific reserve that is ring fenced to that special expense area. And what that enables the council then to do is to fund potentially one-off activities or one-off unforeseen costs that those expense areas are picking up. And that's, again, particularly relevant for Grantham, because it does have things like the Grantham Cemetery, which in the past has suffered from grey water contamination, other issues that have been unforeseen, and that reserve protects against the taxpayer from seeing volatility in the collectible amount. So those reserves are used in that kind of way. I think I've explained the legislation and I've explained the requirements. It's also fair to say that in recent weeks and months, some of the parishes have come forward and wanted to begin a conversation with the council to transfer the responsibility of the functions that are being charged from the council and put them into the parish. Ultimately, what that would mean is that the council would need to relinquish and surrender its control of those assets to enable that function to transfer across. From a parish point of view, that would mean they've got local control, and it would also mean that the charge that's being made sits outside of a referendum limitation. So, as you know, town and parishes aren't currently restricted by a cap on how much they can charge their residents in the same way as districts are and counties are. So if, for example, a parish wanted to inject a significant change in the service delivery by investing, it would have more freedom to do that than the council can do. And I don't know if you can recall, but last year there was conversations about Dysart Park and Grantham trying to achieve a green flag, but would mean perhaps some significant investment to do that. The council ultimately is capped by how much investment it can do and is contained within the parameters it operates as to how much it could locally tax to enable that to happen. That wouldn't be the same case if it was transferred to a parish or a town, but of course Grantham doesn't have the opportunity to transfer it at the moment in the absence of a town council. So there are ongoing conversations, but ultimately it'd be for the council to consider whether it wanted to surrender the activities that are currently in each of those special expense areas. So I think the purpose of the report is just to stimulate the debate and to get the committee's views on whether that direction of travel would be supported, or whether the committee has a view as to whether the special expense areas as they're currently constructed should continue under the current arrangements. Thank you.
Okay, are there any comments in the room? Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chair. You'll not be surprised I'll be concentrating my comments on Bourne rather than on the generality.
Sorry, can you just hold your question a minute, Councillor Knowles? I think that Councillor Adam Stokes just wanted to add a few comments.
Yeah, it was just to fully support what Richard Wiles has said. We did have met with all both Stamford and Bourne town councils and the town clerks, and we have got a meeting in the diary for Langtoft Parish Council as well. So we are having discussions about the removal of these. I will say the removal of these, but obviously it will be a council decision at the end of it, and the decision that the town councils will bring forward as an option as well.
Okay, thank you for that. Councillor Knowles.
Yeah, I'll not take up too much of your time. Clearly, the Bourne Town Council's position is that a couple of months ago we looked and we supported in principle the idea that we pursue the idea of us taking the special expense area and the responsibility for the two pieces of land that are main part of that, which is Dyke playing field and the recreation playing field in Bourne. Subsequent to that, we had another longer discussion last Tuesday, when again the principle remains that we'd like to do that, but clearly subject to a detailed survey and study of all the various costs. Things like trees that are on the rec, and we want a survey of the trees, where the revenue comes from. We know some of it, but we don't know it all. So that there are detailed discussions clearly to be had, but in principle, Bourne Town Council would like to pursue that. It became apparent in the discussion with Adam and Richard that if we put them all together, Grantham is a separate issue because it's not got a town council. Langtoft maybe had a problem that they've not been in discussions before, but both Bourne and Stamford want to pursue. Stamford can't do that in the near future because of Purda, because they have elections coming up, and so we would like to pursue these discussions independently of the others and get things moving, so that perhaps we are able to get them into next year's budget considerations, because obviously the SKDC would have to consider that, and obviously it would have implications on Bourne's budget, so on. So we would like to think that we can pursue these discussions in detail, and also we can do that independent of the other 3 towns that I mentioned in the report. As I said, there are 1 or 2 things, details that we want to go into, but clearly we don't do that at this meeting.
Fine, fine. My understanding is that's what Councillor Adam Stokes has just confirmed. If you can just confirm that is those discussions are ongoing.
Yeah, the discussions are ongoing, and I fully understand where Councillor Knowles is coming from with regards to the forthcoming financial year and the Bourne Town Council.
So we're looking for the support of this body then to take it to, so that we can continue to take it forward, independent of the 3.
Well, I think it's been confirmed that discussions are ongoing. I think that's probably as far as we can go at this stage. I think the Councillor Fieldilt.
Me, Mr. Chairman?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I congratulate Councillor Knowles on championing his division. But I'm sure that Langtoft and the others would also want to be at the front of the queue as well. And I would hope that, you know, we can complete the review, I hope, Adam, you know, in time for all of them to benefit, if we're able to do that. I appreciate there may be some reasons why not. Generally, I welcome the review. Obviously, it perhaps started when myself and others raised the particular issue of Deeping's special expense area. And I welcome what Richard says about, you know, they are there to stop double taxation. The problem that we had, or the perceived problem, certainly, was that we were charging council taxpayers, I think it was £14,000 a year roughly in the Deepings, basically for cutting the grass on the school field. But then the council was also then charging thousands of pounds for the for anyone to rent the our field, who were actually already paying for its upkeep. Can you see what I'm saying? So there was a real perception there.
Councillor Dill, so these comments are noted. Can I bring you back to the report? Just do you have any questions on the report?
I don't have questions, but I thought comments would be welcome. I think I've made my point, Mr. Chairman, but I would say if we can get it in place, I'm sure it would be welcomed by all the districts and those affected. Thank you.
It has been confirmed that that's being worked upon. Are there any other comments? Councillor Ian Stokes.
Thank you. Yes, I'm puzzled by Stamford recreation ground. I understand when Mike Taylor was in Adam's position that he sold a recreation ground for £1 to Stamford Town Council. Now, was that Empingham Road or Uffington Road, or was it somewhere else? Because you see, if that is the case, then something doesn't seem right.
Richard Wild.
Yeah, the Stamford special expense area includes Empingham Road and Uffington Road. Recreation Road was transferred across to the Town Council some years ago. So it's only the 2 that are referenced in the report, Empingham Road and Uffington Road playing fields, that are currently charged to the Stamford SEO. The recreation ground reference, I think, is in relation to Bourne that Councillor Knowles referred to.
Councillor Morgan. I'll come back to it.
First of all, we've mentioned the fact Grantham doesn't have a town council, but that's not necessarily a constant position. And I am aware that there are parties interested in changing that. So it's very interesting what the potential could be in the future for the town council, given what's happening with the other areas, Bourne, Stamford, etc. What I'd like to ask is, I noticed when you look at the SEA reserve level on page 53 for Grantham, that we've got quite a drop in the reserves from 156,000 in 2018-19 to 90,000 21-22. What has that been spent on?
Richard Wiles.
That's predominantly been spent on Wyndham Park. I think if you go down Wyndham Park today compared to 5 years ago, you'll see it's pretty much been transformed with a visitor centre and children's play areas and recreational areas as well. So a lot of the investment's gone on to Wyndham Park and Queen Elizabeth Park, actually. A new car park's been installed as well. And of course, both areas continue to maintain their green flag status, which requires investment as well. That's a good example of where that reserve's been used to inject that kind of step change in service provision. And that's how predominantly that's been used. But as I mentioned, Grantham SEA has quite a strong, heavy asset base. So that reserve also needs to be used to maintain and keep to standard the assets that are charged to that SEA as well.
Okay, Councillor Mark Whittington.
Yeah, thanks, Chairman. I mean, I think as a general principle, I think I support these SEAs actually going back to the town councils and the parish councils. But I think I'm picking up from something that Councillor Knowles referred to. I think each of them, it'd be great if they could all go at the same time, but I'm thinking that there are specific reasons as to why they can't. Obviously with Grantham, there's no town council, so there's nobody to pass them back to. And actually, if Bourne are prepared to sort of, if discussions are at a fairly advanced stage, if we could get it in for next budget, that would think they're really great. But accepting the Stamford and Langtoft, if it's not possible this year, then certainly making progress towards it. So I think as a general principle, it's the right thing to do, actually. But my real question was kind of around the reserve levels and what happens to those reserve balances? Because presumably if Bourne do go forward, at the moment the Bourne reserve is £32,000 sitting in the balance sheet at SK. What happens to that 32,000? Will that be transferred over to Bourne?
Richard Wells.
Yes, the proposal would be, because that reserve is effectively been obtained through the taxation process, then that reserve belongs with the transfer of the assets. So it would go back to that relative body if that's the transfer that takes place. Just make a general point about timescales and appreciating that ultimately these are community assets. So the council needs to be able to reconcile with itself that it's relinquishing and surrendering these assets across. So there would be a financial balance sheet implication for the council to just understand for itself, because clearly these do have an asset value. So accepting that point is agreed to by council. Clearly, as a community asset transfer, there's a legal process that needs to be followed as well in terms of how those assets are advertised for disposal, etc. So some of the timescales aren't wholly within the authority's control, and I think we all appreciate there's only a once-a-year opportunity to do this, and it's that budget setting time. The majority of parish and town councils will set their budgets in January, so they need absolute clarity probably this side of Christmas that transfer is going to go ahead. But it will need both parties, as Councillor Knowles has said, representing Bourne Town Council. They need to do their due diligence, and the council needs to be satisfied it's got its protections in place as well. If it's transferring assets, it needs to know it's got the appropriate covenants and restrictions that prevent any other ultimate disposals at a later date that could be financially advantageous to that party rather than the council. So there is quite a lot of work to be done. I think we're all sharing the ambition to do it within the timescales, but reality is we're only talking weeks. So I think as long as all parties are pragmatic about that, then nobody's going to be disappointed. But clearly there are decisions that need to be made and proper due processes that need to be followed. So
fine. What are the costs of administration on these budgets? Do we have those costs? Are you able to share with us detail as to how much it costs to administer a £538,000 budget in terms of collection and expenditure, as well as for all the other areas?
Charges are made to them. I haven't got the detail to hand, but we can share that with the
okay, if they can be shared by email, I'd like to understand.
Yeah, so central support costs are charged to the SEAs. Of course, what that would mean is in the absence of the SEA, that central support cost will come back into the authority. So it'd come back into the general fund, whereas at the moment it's being charged to the SEA and taxed on that basis. That cost would still remain with the council. It would just be charged somewhere else.
Yeah, of course. And of course, the various town councils would need to find the budget to administer those funds. Okay. Yeah.
Just answer that particular question.
I want to take everyone's comments, the final comments, but I would like to make some progress. So I'll take comments from the three people who've already spoken, and then we've got a very substantial report that we need to go through as well that I'd like to cover today. Councillor Knowles.
Said that the last time I got an analysis of the reserve contributor support cost, they were just short of 10 grand for Bourne. So there was 9,805 in the 2021 budget, and that was the support costs that were put into this equation.
Okay, well, I've requested the updated information. Councillor Dilks, if you have some
Thank
closing
you, Mr. Chairman.
comment.
I'll be quick. And I think there is a consensus here to, to devolve these decision making and responsibilities as far as we're possibly able to make them as local as possible. You did ask, and you interrupted me when you quite reasonably asked what was my question, and I completely forgot to ask it, of course. And the question was about that point about the double taxation of charging council taxpayers and then charging them again when they actually use the facility. And I wanted an assurance that that is not happening elsewhere, i.e. in Bourne, Stamford or Langtoft. Thank you.
I'll take all of the comments and then I'll ask for a response. Councillor Morgan.
I mean, Richard kindly touched on this, but I know can see the positive side of transferring the SEA areas over, but are there other risks involved? Say, for example, let's just say, for example, we got the town council in Grantham and we said, right, we're going to have a cemetery. And then something, as you quite rightly say, I know it is actually quite a high risk area. Suddenly there's a £200,000 plus bill to sort out drainage on that site. Now I've used that just as a wild example, but what would happen then? So in other words, where the parish councils take on an asset that potentially could lumber them with a significant overhead or cost that they haven't actually got the funds for.
Richard Wiles.
I mean, I think that goes back to the due diligence that Councillor Knowles said on behalf of the town council. Clearly, if they're going to accept these assets, they need to accept full liability. There's not going to be a kind of underwritten element that says any significant cost will be borne by the district. Once they've transferred, they've transferred. So all parties need to go into this eyes wide open. But as I said in my opening comments, is the town and parish is not fettered by limitations on how much it can raise locally to maintain and invest in these assets in the same way the council is. The council's capped by its referendum limits that are set by central government. Town and parish currently, and I stress currently because each year the national government threatens to impose some kind of limitations, but at the moment town and parishes aren't restricted. So if they charge £5 one year for Band D, they can increase that to £10 the following year. If they can reconcile with themselves, that's justified. But the district can't do that. So they have got freedoms. Just going back to Councillor Dilks' point, I mean, no, we can't give that guarantee. So if you take Windsor Park, for example, all the taxpayers of Grantham contribute towards it. But clearly, if you go down there and use facilities and buy a drink, you're paying to use those facilities. What was happening in Deepins was that the parish was paying towards the upkeep of the field, but it was actually One Life, not ourselves. One Life were charging users of it for sport use of that field. So there was kind of a double layer of charging.
Okay, thank you. If there are no further comments, I'd like to make some progress. Moving on then to item 9, progress on the new customer feedback process. I believe this is with Councillor Linda Wotton.
Thank you, Chairman, and good afternoon, everyone. I am extremely pleased to bring this item back to the committee following the project initiation being agreed in July. Officers have produced a draft new feedback policy, which is attached for consideration today, which incorporates the comments made by this committee with a flowchart for the customer compliments, complaints and comments journey. This is aligned to the approved housing feedback policy. So we need one way of how the council deals with complaints, comments and compliments. There is no change to how residents can complain. This is still by all forms of contact, such as by telephone, email, online or face-to-face. It is just that complaints will be dealt with in 2 stages instead of 3. The policy that we have had in place since 2013 requires updating to reflect this. Officers are progressing, looking at new software providers and having demonstrations on how these would work for the council. There is software in place, but it isn't a specific specific package for complaints, which means that it isn't easy to navigate. Doesn't prompt officers for responses, and doesn't provide the relevant information for reporting for members. A new specific package would mean that any officer can input a complaint, whereas customer services and housing generally input them currently. The onus will move to the services to progress their complaints, and as discussed, there will be extensive training provided to officers and members on how to handle compliments, complaints and comments to ensure that we are meeting all our obligations as a council. I hope that the committee support the recommendations in this report and endorse the draft policy to be approved by Cabinet at its October meeting and give delegation to the Deputy Chief Executive to progress the new software system. This committee will receive another update at its meeting in November. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, are there any comments and questions in the room? Councillor Charmaine Morgan.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the work that's gone into this process. I'd like to look at page 72. Slight concern about this. When we cannot deal with a complaint, when it has not personally affected you. So does that mean a councillor could not raise a complaint? Or for example, the incident I mentioned earlier with the dogs running down the street that weren't dealt with, that may not necessarily impact on the person who's raising the complaint, but they are raising a legitimate concern. I'm not convinced that that should be in there.
Do you have any other comments or questions? I don't want to get into a dialogue today. If you can group your comments and questions.
I will go through and just, I'll let if other people want to raise and I'll look at the.
Fine. Councillor Whittington, you wanted to add to that?
Thanks. I'm pleased you raised that, Councillor Morgan, because I've got that down as one of mine, because I'm thinking in terms of, can you make, if you're representing somebody who's not got capacity, because in effect, it doesn't personally affect you, but if you're dealing with a complaint that a child's made, or an elderly person who may not have full capacity, I'm just very much concerned that, and I think that takes, on your point, Councillor, sometimes somebody who can't take a point or complain for themselves will need somebody else to do it for them.
Alan Robinson.
Thank you, Chairman. I think that both of you have raised really valid points there, and we'll take each case in its merit, but I think we can take that out of the scheme without damaging what we've got already. So if everyone's in, no one's got a problem with that, then we'll take it forward and take that part out.
Councillor Phil Dilks.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I'm actually a bit concerned on page 72 at the bottom when we cannot deal with a complaint. The first bullet point is we can't deal with a complaint if more than 3 months have passed since the problem occurred. That sounds very reasonable, but currently I'm dealing with a local resident who raised a complaint a year ago and was not a complaint, raised an issue a year ago and received an email to say, we'll look into this and we will deal with it. And it was never dealt with. And only now she's come to me and said, look, can you help with this? So obviously I'm sort of, taking that up. But so that 3 months seems to be
too narrow.
Yeah.
Alan Robinson.
This is for brand new issues. So if something was something you really feel like you want to complain about, you haven't done anything at all for 3 months, then I think that's a reasonable step. On an ongoing situation like the one that you described, Councillor Dilks, then of course, we would escalate that to being a formal complaint and deal with it through our process. No concerns about that at all. That this is really so if somebody decides they want to complain because something else has happened during that 3 months and they go back to something that they didn't want to complain about, didn't seem an issue at the time. So that's what the reason that's in there. And in your situation, we definitely would include it.
Fine. Are there any other comments and questions in the room? Councillor Mark Whittington.
Yes, thank you. The other 2 points that I've got is one I saw on page 73, which I think is part of the answer a bit further down. It's where the complainant acts in an unreasonable manner. And I'd sort of put down there the vexatious claimant, which I think is dealt with sort of at the bottom of page 73 when you then talk about unreasonable persistent complaints. And I'm just wondering there because, I am aware that there have been instances where, problems have been caused and quite often. And I'm really thinking about both staff welfare issues here and also member issues as well, because I'm aware of situations where some of these vexatious complainants have actually started to make threats against members of staff, and also I'm aware from personal experience of when people have made threats against the councillors. What we can actually do there to sort of protect, especially officers, because they shouldn't be subjected to that sort of level of abuse. I think councillors, we kind of take it as part of the course, but so we're wondering around what we can sort of do there around offering support. It's not specifically related to complaints, but I think it does have an impact on officers. And then on the final page, page 75, when we talk about anonymous complaints, because here I'm thinking to myself, this is a difficult area potentially, because there may be several reasons as to why a complainant wants to remain anonymous. They may feel that they want to remain anonymous because they may feel threatened by the person or something that whatever that they're complaining about. So there may be an element of coercion in there. And I'm also wondering then on the flip side to this, that we may have people who want to try and stir something up against an officer if they had a dispute with them personally, you know what I mean, in private life, as it were. So I'm just around anonymous, I think that's a really difficult area, because there may be reasons, some very, very valid, but some not that aren't valid and are deliberately intended to cause problems. So just a few comments around that I think would be quite useful. Thanks.
Alan Robinson.
Thank you. So I think, as you alluded to, it's vexatious customers is one issue, isn't it? Where we recently signed up to the mental health charter. We want to look after all of us, the whole team, the councillors and officers, of course. And we are hoping to bring an actual policy on how we deal with vexatious complainants, because we do often get complaints that are that we can't learn from, that they're just ongoing things, or they're the same complaint with slightly different words in them time and time again. I know from personal experience that it is really difficult for the teams to deal with. It can really get on top of them. So we want to bring back a policy to deal with those difficult, perhaps vexatious customers, so that it empowers officers and members to kind of say, well, I've done as much as I can and we won't do any more. And that's really helpful, I find. In terms of whether people are wanting to give their details, obviously it helps us deal with a complaint better if we can get into a dialogue with them, so we can really understand and get to the bottom of it. If we know who they are, and we can go back, work out what outcome they want, all those things. But if we get something and we can learn from it, or we can improve the service, or we can fix something, clearly we'll accept anything like that and try to make the service better. So yeah, it is a difficult one, but obviously we can't feed back if we don't know who they are. So that's the other side of it, of course.
Okay, are there any other comments in the room? Okay, I have a couple of comments. I'd like to know what's out of, I don't want to get into a dialogue, but I've got a couple of series of questions. What's out of scope on this report? Is HR in scope? Are the companies, the third-party companies, Leisure SK, Environment SK, are they in scope on this report? The benefits team, the housing team? I want to understand what the coverage is of this complaints process. So if I have a constituent who has a complaint with a service at, say, the Mears Centre, that's Leisure SK, would that be in scope? If I have an employee in the council who has a problem with a councillor, is that in scope, or is that the monitoring officer? Can you talk a little bit about what's in scope and out of scope, and then have a series of follow-up questions?
Thank you, Chairman. So one of the I do know around is those complaints about councillor behaviour. So those would not be in scope of this complaints. This complaint, but that's dealt with through a different process using the monitoring officer's powers through the code of conduct. So those would definitely be outside. If an officer made such a complaint, that will be dealt with through that. Although it would be possible for them to take out a grievance, I suppose. But again, that's not part of this process. This is more for external customers. But most of the housing is not included in this because they've got their own separate complaints process, and that's really what's brought us to this event. We didn't want them to have a different process. We wanted to have a process that was, you know, a system that was the same, so it was mirrored, so that from a customer's point of view, it isn't complicated. They just make a complaint, and we'll determine whether that's around HRA or it's around the rest of the organisation. I think I'll probably bring Debbie in around the way it works with the companies, because my understanding was people could complain to us, but I think the companies as well will have their own complaints procedures. But I would expect that people may wish to complain directly to us. There may be some policies and things like that that people wish to complain about that are within our gift. So again, it would be included in the scope of this as far as I'm concerned. Yes.
Debbie, can you comment on this? I mean, as I said, I mean, we have different companies, but from the perception, we're different companies doing different levels of service to our residents. And some of them, the residents don't understand the difference between it being a third-party company and South Kesteven District Council. So I'd like to understand where the line is that we're going to listen to a complaint, or we're not going to listen to a complaint because that's a guy who gets paid by the council, sits in a council building, but is notionally under a different employee.
So the companies are already included in the complaints policy. So in the figure the committee's received, they do include Invest SK and
so they're all included.
So they're included.
And these policies
so
will be imposed upon the directors of the companies.
So they may have their own policies in place, but when it comes to Leisure SK, for example, so there is a paper tomorrow around the performance of Leisure SK, and included in that is the monitoring of the services. So they have the figures for complaints and comments as part of the monitoring of Leisure SK and its performance.
So I do have a series of follow-up questions, but I'm still interested by that. How is this authority going to impose upon an independent third party a complaints procedure?
So we're responsible as a council for getting those services delivered, aren't we? So if people want to complain that those services weren't delivered effectively, as a council, we have a responsibility to do that. The companies that we own, we do have control over, don't we, with the shareholders? So the council-owned companies, and yes, they have independent directors and are separate, but there is an element whereby we as the shareholder, we have some say as to how those companies carry out their business. And obviously, at very least, they are contractors of ours, aren't they? So there are contractors as well. And if this was a private company carrying out leisure, I would still expect to receive complaints to the council about the level of performance provided by that contractor. So whoever that were, whether that, the previous one or Leisure SK, for example. So
okay, so I think that's an interesting observation. There'd be some sort of service level agreement mechanism that adopted a minimum standard and a complaints procedure. But okay, obviously, what I'd like that to be understood. I've got a couple of follow-up questions. I hope we've not covered them all. On the unreasonable and persistent complainants, I totally understand why this is in here, and I totally also understand why where there is a policy for where we cannot deal with a complainant. That's a nuclear option to put an officer in that place, and I think that there should be some sort of political oversight, be it a chair of a scrutiny committee, be it the local member, be it the monitoring. There needs to be some sort of democratic element to going back to a customer and saying, you're complaining, but we're now not listening. Because it's such a nuclear option. I wouldn't want to put an officer in a position where they're saying, no, we're going to stop listening now. That really has to be politically driven, I think, would be my take. I'd be interested in your comments on that. Anonymous complaints, I agree, certainly with HR. I think that there's a lot of reasons why they ought to be in. There ought to be a policy for people to complain anonymously. But as I say, I think in general, I think it's a quantum leap forward in where we are, and I certainly welcome it. I'd like to understand in the November report, though, a little bit more about the feedback loop as to what we're doing with complaints. It's maybe half the work, but it's not really the bit that we're interested in. It's how we're learning and developing from those complaints. And I'd like to see the journey of the feedback loop and who's going to be responsible for that. You can comment on those questions in comments in a moment. I'd like to make some progress. Charmaine, is there any other comments in the room? Charmaine, you wanted to make a couple of final observations.
Yeah, first of all, I want to support the importance of including the contractors within the process. I think it is extremely important. It is a really important mechanism for us because people out there actually are in effect monitoring our contractors because we're not there at the receiving end of their services. And equally good comments as well. I think we need to be able to receive them. So if we get a plumber who we've contracted to go in and they do a great job and we've got a happy customer, because we might well then think of re-signing them up again for another long contract, when the opposite may apply. I mentioned earlier, and I know it kind of got pushed back here, but I think the areas of complaint, I asked if we were looking at out of hours, the actual scoping, which has led to certainly some complaints I've received. Are we looking at, or can we include that in this? Because I think the feedback's really important that's coming back from some of the members of the public around that area. And in fact, even I've experienced when you ring up at a weekend, the answer machine, to be fair, ours is better than Links County Council, which is none. There's no service there at the weekend now out of house. We're better than that, but that's been narrowed, and I think we need to review that.
Okay, and if there are no further comments, I just have one further comment. And if on the estimated costs on page 66, the cost is to be investigated further. Just remind you, we are the Finance Committee. I think we need to know some numbers on there. When is that investigation going to be completed, and when are we going to see some numbers? If you can comment on those last few items, please. Alan Robinson.
Okay, thank you, Chairman. So, with regard to your question, it's a really big decision for an individual to make to withdraw a service in that way. I wouldn't want to do it myself. I've had experience of dealing with these ones before. We pull together maybe a panel and we can discuss how, when we bring something back, how that may be made up and whether there is a political, a councillor involved in that, whether it's one of the portfolio holders or the chairman of the scrutiny committee or whoever we feel is appropriate. We'll review that and consider it, but it doesn't feel safe to make that decision on you. It's a very uncomfortable decision to make on your own. I agree with you about those complaints where we don't know who they're from. They still need to be looked at. There could be something really serious. In terms of the issue around out of hours, now this is the kind of thing that should come up, and we should be part of the learning cycle that you talked about, Chairman. So if we start to get complaints that are about the out of hours, that should give us and put us on notice that there's something that we need to do differently, that it's not being favourable. I think it's probably worth me kind of taking that away, though, to speak to the team specifically on Councillor Morgan's concerns at the moment and see whether there's any information we can share about what it's reasonable to expect and what we're doing now, because I'm quite surprised by the incident that's occurred. So, sorry, Chairman.
Okay.
Finances. We needed to know what the process was, and now we can scope it up, and we'll bring something back as soon as we can. Probably be November time.
Okay, so we're going to see some numbers in November. I really would like to get on to the last comment, Phil, Councillor Dilts. If you want to make a closing
allowing me to come
comment,
back. I've just been going through it, and actually, there's actually nowhere does it say how do you make a complaint. There is, we'd like your feedback, and there's how do you feedback. But under the complaints process, it starts by saying, this is how we're going to deal with your complaints. It doesn't say how you actually make one. Then it goes on to say, we'll acknowledge your complaint, etc. But it doesn't, I just think we need something in there. Look, at the end of the day, if you've got the complaint, this is how you make it.
Fine. I think at the bottom of page 70, there is a process in there. I think it would be useful to see more detail of that in the policy.
Not making a complaint.
Okay, I'd like to thank you for the comments on that, and I think we're expecting a little bit more detail in November. I'd like to move on. Item 10, update on local authority searches. This, I believe, is with Alan Robinson.
Chairman, actually, if I think Councillor Wotton will introduce this, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Apologies. Councillor Underwood.
Thank you, Chairman. This is an update report on the figures for local authority searches, which both this and the Governance and Audit Committee have been monitoring. This report is very positive, and I would like the committee to note that the council is now completing the searches in less than the 10 days target, which is a fantastic achievement from earlier in the year when it was taking 3 times that target. Of course, there were numerous reasons why the target was not being met, but with some interventions, this has significantly improved. I think it is worth noting that a neighbouring authority is looking at how the searches are completed to see if there are any improvement measures that can be implemented, having recently completed the same exercise. I'm sure the committee would like to continue to monitor the performance as part of its usual dashboard reporting cycle, and thank officers for working to reduce the turnaround for searches, which has significantly improved the reputation of the council. Thank you, Chairman.
Okay, are there any comments and questions in the room? Councillor Ian Stokes.
Yes, thank you. This was brought to the Governance and Audit's attention because of the length that it was taking, due primarily to the stamp duty holiday and what have you. This has now ceased, well, and I would have expected the time limit to have gone down substantially with the change in the basis that they were working. So it is a pleasing report, but it's unfortunate that it's probably cost some residents of our area a few £1,000s in stamp duty because of the delays.
Councillor Mark Whittington.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Just a couple of points. On page 78, 14.d, it talks about the planning system, uniform, the land charges system, total land charges, TLC do not fully integrate. Obviously, we seem to sort of have a bit of a recurring issue with systems not integrating. Just wondering how much of a risk is that and what mitigation we can do around that. Just a little bit further question is on point E, it says we do not have an up-to-date GIS mapping process. Just a bit of information as to what that is and what impact it would have. And then finally on page 79, point 3, the financial implications. We talked about a temporary budget increase has been provided, but we need to sort of potentially increase the resource going forward. Just an indication as to how much potentially that's going to be. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Alan Robinson, do you want to comment on those 3 questions?
Yeah, no problem. So in terms of finance, if we start with the last one, we reckon we're going through a review of how we do the process at the moment. So we've got a colleague in and working with him, got a meeting this afternoon, and we need to know how much resource this takes. But equally, in terms of when we're trying to make this much more efficient, and if we can make it more efficient, actually that might mean we can try and gain a greater market share for this area of work, because the private companies do this as well. So we would hope that during the budget process we can cover this off through fees and charges, Chairman. So it shouldn't be making a loss or a profit. It should be break even. We should be charging this. We do potentially need to include an additional officer for resilience in the coming year, in the next budget round. But that's something we'll bring forward through the budget process. But it will be covered by the kind of the cost that we charge by fees and charges. So it shouldn't have a negative effect on the overall costs. The other questions in terms of the GIS system, global information system. So that's kind of, it's a way you plot all these properties that have land charges against them onto a map. We do have that, but the team are not as confident as they ought to be in that, so they have to do additional checks. We want to do some work on that over the coming months as part of the review that we're doing, because if we can take some of those workarounds and additional checks out, that will give the team the opportunity to be more efficient, and that will make them more resilient and robust. And again, it's the same with the integration. With land charges, information comes from a number of different sources, be that from the planning team, from building control, from our housing teams, from lots of places. And it just needs to be as slick as it can be. And that's, again, some work that we're doing at the moment to try and, first of all, make sure it goes into the system properly and that we're confident that the data is accurate, so that we can very easily transfer that back out to the customers. So there's a lot of work going on that.
Alan, can I push you on that third question about Mark's question was, what are our risks associated with the lack of integration there? Are we facing financial risks with the lack of integration there?
The risk is that there's workarounds, Chairman, so the staff have to work a little bit harder and looking at different systems. So there isn't a risk as such that we would end up with additional costs, but we are perhaps missing the opportunity to be more efficient and to reduce the kind of the cost of each individual search, the amount it costs us and the time it takes us to do. But I don't think there's any risk for the lack of integration.
So you're confident there's no risk of us giving out false information?
No, and actually that's definitely not. That's again, there's lots and lots of checks and balances go into this process. And actually that confidence in the data is the key, making sure the data is accurate when it's put in, and making sure the correct checks and balances are put in place, and the team are really clear on doing that.
Okay, are there any other questions in the room? Councillor Morgan.
So obviously this is our performance management work. So the governance and audit and other committees brought this forward. It was seen as being a really important area of work to prioritise, and to additional resources were added to it. But in addition to that, that's not an ongoing solution, as you say, and that's why I was so keen to get somebody to help us to review the processes and to make it as efficient and as effective as it can possibly be. So we've got that in place now. So that's happening as we speak. So that will give us the kind of the size of the problem and enable us to get the right number of staff whilst still remaining resilient. The issue with this is, and the risk that will always be there, is that it is a very labour intensive kind of work. There's a lot of human intervention in it. And therefore the resilience in a small team is always a challenge. And we just need to make it as efficient as possible so that doesn't happen, and also probably make it as simple as possible so that when we do need extra resource, we can get that in without, more easily, with less training. So that's really the kind of idea of the work that we're doing at the moment. And I think that does mitigate a majority of the risks that we talk about that.
I'll come back at the end after I've Councillor Phil.
You're very kind. Thank you, Chairman. I take what Councillor Stokes says about the end of the stamp duty. And that's clearly had an effect, on the rise. But I think it is worth saying, this committee was pretty annoyed. It was taking more than a month, some months ago, to get these things turned around, and it's now down to less than a week. So I think from this committee we should say thank you and well done to the staff. There has been, immediate measures put into place, additional resources, and all the other things, additional overtime and all that. That is, as Charmaine says, possibly a sticker, but it has, we are now down. So I'd just sort of like to say thank you and credit where it's due. Thank you.
Yeah, agreed. Just a comment on that. These are business days, not calendar days. So it's actually taking 6 weeks at one stage, but it's now down to a sensible time frame. Okay, thank you for those comments, Councillor Dills. Councillor Knowles.
Thank you, Chair. I'll try to be brief. It was in summer 2019 when I raised this at this meeting. And then 2-3 months later, we got an answer that said, well, it was getting better. And we raised it again in 2020, and again, it was getting better. And now, thankfully, it seems to have got better, and I think that's welcome. But it's only a couple of weeks ago that I received complaints from the sector saying they were still taking a long time. So I'm wondering whether how long these figures have been in place, the 4 days, and for how long they've been there and over what period they were taken. And on each occasion I brought this up before, you, Chair, said that we wanted figures rather than comments, and we just said it's 4 days. Can we have some figures to back that up, please, at some stage?
Alan Robinson.
So I suppose the answer is yes. We can get the numbers that involved. Of course we can. And we can bring those to another meeting or email.
I think what Councillor Knowles is asking for is for this target to be monitored.
Yeah.
And ongoing monitoring on a quarterly basis as to what it's sort of taking. Okay.
Chairman, that just for information, that's in the normal processing anyway. So you won't get that in your normal quarterly performance management, and obviously I know members are particularly interested in this area, so we can.
And to Councillor Knowles's point as to how long the 4 days target has been in process, wasn't 4 days ago, was it?
We wrote the paper. The paper's finalised on the 28th of August, so it's definitely then. So it's been a steady progress on the way down, but we do get some strange emails, and this is typical in this sector, from people who say I've been waiting weeks, and actually what it is it can often be they've gone down, got a private search done, which does come through us, but and we do those and turn those around quickly, but they're counting the bit that the private company does around it, and sometimes even the solicitors might say it's us, and it isn't. So we do look at that. I looked at one the other week that said they'd been waiting 3 weeks, and we'd had it for 4 days. We got it, turned it round and sent it out, but to the customer, it was longer than that because it had been in all the processes on the way.
Thanks for that clarification. Are there any other comments from the committee? I'll come back to Councillor. Councillor Morgan.
I was going to follow up my earlier comments to Adam, really, and Councillor Stokes, and that was, given the comment in here about the need for the ongoing budget to support this level of performance within that department, what safeguards does he foresee could be put in place? Or perhaps Richard, either of you, to make sure that we have got the budget there?
Councillor Stokes? Councillor Stokes?
Yeah, with regards to that, I mean, I think Alan perfectly illustrated how it will go forward with regards to the fees and charges. Potentially, if we get more in, because obviously houses are still selling quite quickly, we'll get more fees in, so we'll be able to cover the staff in on that. But we have heard the problems. I mean, I'm well aware because I was one that was log jammed in the search system, so I was well aware of the problems in it. So we are understanding of that with regards to the forthcoming budget as well.
I just wanted to make the point, Mr. Chairman, because I think for the benefit of kind of the record, I think it was mentioned that the target's 4 days. The target's actually 10 days. The performance is 4 days. And I think that's the dilemma I think the team are kind of coming to the conclusion of. What's the council ambition in terms of target? Because clearly you then resource to deliver that target. At the moment, we're overachieving. So there's an argument that says actually we've got the resource levels are probably a little bit higher than we need them because we're now achieving at 4. But if the aspiration is 4, then clearly the resource level needs to be maintained at the current level. But actually the target's 10. So we're exceeding it by some way at the moment.
I mean, my personal take on that is that 4 days is almost too fast. I think 10 days is a reasonable time frame. It's a reasonable time frame. We know that solicitors are absolutely log jammed up. nationally. So I can imagine that a lot of residents are blaming us for delays in solicitors in conveyances in the UK. But I suppose that would all be part of a budgeting process and a planning process going forward. If there are any other questions in the room? No, then I'd like to move on. Thank you very much for that report. Item 11, the work programme. Mark and I will be meeting to discuss the work programme in scheduling. Are there any other questions or comments on that? We're quite happy to take those questions and comments outside of the room or at any stage. I'm not seeing anyone, so I'll move on. Item 12, is there any other business in the room? I have no other business. Okay, so it's 12:50, so I'll bring this meeting to a close. Thank you everyone today who attended. Thank you.